The Roman Empire didn't fall because of an invasion. It fell because one morning, the world's richest superpower woke up and realized it had no money left, no silver for its coins, no gold for its treasury, no funds to pay its soldiers, not even enough grain to feed the capital. And in that single moment, everything Rome had built, the roads, the legions, the cities, the glory, became a bill it could no longer pay. Before the barbarians came, before the fires, before the last emperor fled, Rome's economy had already collapsed so completely that the empire was a corpse still standing. This is the untold story of how an empire that ruled the world lost everything, not to war, but to math. Before Rome began dying, it lived larger than any civilization in the ancient world. Gold flowed into the capital like water. Cargo ships packed with grain, spices, marble, and silk crowded the Mediterranean until it looked like a marketplace made of waves. Legions marched through continents collecting tribute, taxes, land, and loyalty. Rome wasn't just a city. It was the beating economic heart of 3 continents. And for centuries, it looked unstoppable. Every new conquest brought wealth. Every new province paid taxes. Every victory filled the treasury with silver. But beneath all the glory, something fragile formed. Something no one wanted to see. Rome's economy was built like a ladder that leaned forward. As long as Rome kept climbing, conquering new lands, the ladder stayed balanced. But the moment expansion slowed, the ladder began to tilt backward. The empire didn't rely on production. It relied on conquest. It didn't grow wealth. It took wealth. When that flow slowed, the economy began to starve. But no one noticed. The streets were still crowded. The markets were loud. Gold still shined in the hands of the elite. From a distance, the empire looked flawless, unbreakable. Yet deep in the countryside, small cracks began spreading. Farmers complained about taxes. Local markets struggled as imported grain undercut their prices. Entire regions depended on Rome's protection, but paid more each year to receive it. And the wealth itself, the very thing Rome depended on, was not real. It was borrowed, stolen, extracted, forced. The empire was becoming rich in the same way a person becomes wealthy, by taking loans they will never repay. At its height, when Rome looked strongest, that was the moment its fall quietly began. For centuries, Rome expanded like a rising tide. Every new province meant more land, more people, more taxes, and more glory. The empire grew so wide that on some days, the sun never truly set on Roman soil. But there was a cost so large that even the empire's wealth began to tremble beneath it. Rome needed roads, thousands of miles of them, carved through mountains and forests. It needed bridges, forts, outposts, and entire cities built from the ground up. Every distant frontier required garrisons. Every conquered region demanded governors, scribes, tax collectors, and soldiers to enforce peace. And as the empire's borders stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas, the bill kept rising. The roads that brought trade also brought expenses. The soldiers who protected the empire demanded pay, farmland, and pensions. The bureaucracy that kept order grew larger each decade, feeding on the empire's treasury like a hungry flame. Rome wasn't simply ruling lands, it was paying for them, heavily. And when the empire stopped expanding, the income stopped growing. But the costs never stopped. In fact, they multiplied. Each new frontier required armies just to hold it. The Great Wall in Britain, forts along the Rhine, defensive lines in the east. Rome had built a world so large that keeping it alive became more expensive than conquering it. And slowly, quietly, the empire began to feel something it had never felt before, the weight of its own size. The treasury still looked full, but the gold inside was already spoken for. For centuries, Rome grew wealthy by conquering. Provinces paid tribute. Defeated kingdoms paid gold. War brought spoils, and spoils fed the empire's treasury. But once expansion slowed, Rome needed a new source of money. It turned to the one place it had never squeezed this hard before, its own people. And so began the Roman tax crisis, a slow tightening of the empire's grip, felt in every village, town, farm, and workshop. Taxes rose, then rose again, and again. Not just on land, but on windows, doors, crops, livestock, sales, inheritances, even the number of pillars a home had. Nothing escaped the tax collector's ink. The rich found loopholes. They purchased tax immunity. They bought influence. The poor, they had no such escape. They paid until they had nothing left. In rural provinces, farmers abandoned their land, not because the soil failed, but because the taxes did. Fields that once fed cities were left empty because the owners fled into forests, mountains, or the edges of the empire where Roman officials couldn't reach them. Entire communities disappeared from records, not from war, but from tax pressure. And the tax collectors themselves, once mere administrators, became feared like wolves. Backed by soldiers, debt officers, and the authority of the empire, they could seize land, livestock, tools, homes, even people. It reached a point where invaders at the border were less frightening than a knock from the tax office. Rome's economy wasn't failing because of war. It was failing because its people were being drained dry. This was the moment the empire stopped being a guardian and became a burden its citizens could no longer carry. For centuries, Rome's power flowed from silver. Silver paid the soldiers. Silver fueled trade. Silver built cities, temples, roads, and empires. But silver was not infinite, and as Rome expanded, conquered lands became fewer, while the mines that once poured wealth into the empire began to dry. In the West, Spanish and Gaulish mines that once produced mountains of silver turned out only dust and shattered rock. In the East, trade routes grew dangerous as hostile kingdoms blocked caravans bringing precious metal into the empire. And slowly, the stream of silver that fed Rome faded to a thin trickle. The government felt the shortage first. Coin production slowed. Treasury officials whispered. Merchants grew suspicious. To hide the crisis, the empire made a decision that would destroy its money forever. They mixed their silver coins with cheap metals. At first, citizens didn't notice. The coins looked similar enough. But over the years, as more and more copper replaced silver, the coins grew lighter, duller, cheaper. Merchants began weighing coins in markets. Soldiers complained their pay felt thin, and the people felt the truth. The empire's money was losing its soul. As silver vanished, trust vanished with it. And when trust dies, money dies. Rome had built its economy on precious metal. Now that metal was disappearing, and with it, the foundations of the empire's wealth. When Rome began mixing its silver with cheap metals, the people did not panic immediately. Coins still changed hands. Markets still opened. Soldiers were still paid. But then the truth became impossible to hide. Prices began to rise, slowly at first, then violently. A loaf of bread that once cost a handful of coins now cost a pocketful. Farmers refused to bring grain to market. Merchants demanded more coins than most citizens had ever carried. And as the coins grew lighter, the people grew suspicious. Markets began weighing coins instead of counting them. Some traders accepted only foreign currency. Others stopped accepting money altogether, demanding goods in exchange. Rome's economy no longer ran on trust. It ran on fear. Soldiers furious at receiving worthless pay, demanded raises. Legions threatened revolt. To keep the army loyal, emperors ordered more coins to be minted, millions of them. Each new coin made the old ones worth even less. Inflation began feeding on itself. Citizens hid their savings. Merchants raised prices daily. Farmers refused to sell grain to the cities. And the empire discovered a truth as old as money itself. When a currency dies, so does the stability of a nation. Rome still looked powerful from a distance. The marble buildings, the armies, the wealth. But up close, you could feel the panic in the markets, hear the tension in the streets, see the economy slipping out of the empire's own hands. The richest civilization in the ancient world was beginning to drown in its own money. Rome's survival depended on its soldiers. The legions were the backbone of the empire, loyal, disciplined, feared across continents. But armies are not loyal to marble, temples, or flags. Armies are loyal to pay. And as Rome's coins lost value, the legions felt it first. Soldiers demanded raises to match the rising prices. Officers complained that their pay could no longer feed their families. Frontier troops threatened mutiny if they weren't compensated for the danger they faced. The emperors knew the truth. To lose the army was to lose the empire. So they paid, again and again, no matter the cost. More coins were minted. More silver was diluted. Taxes were raised higher and higher to pay the demands of the legions. Every time the empire tried to strengthen the army, it weakened the economy. And then came the real danger. The soldiers realized their own power. If they didn't like the emperor, they could replace him. If they wanted a bonus, they could force it. If they were denied, they could simply declare another emperor, one who would pay them. Legions no longer defended Rome, they controlled it. Generals bribed soldiers with promises of gold. Politicians bought loyalty with land. Entire armies swore allegiance not to the empire, but to whoever paid the most. What Rome had built to protect itself was now capable of tearing it apart. The empire's greatest strength had become its most expensive and most dangerous liability. The crisis began quietly. A governor refused orders. A general refused pay. A legion declared its own commander-emperor. No one realized it, but Rome had just stepped into the most chaotic half-century in its history. Between the years 235 and 284, the empire became a battlefield, not against foreign invaders, but against itself. Soldiers killed emperors. Generals overthrew generals. Governors declared independence. Legions fought other legions in the same uniform. In 50 years, Rome had 26 emperors. Only one died peacefully. Every new emperor needed loyalty, and loyalty came at a price. Massive bonuses, land, privileges, gold. Rome didn't have, so more coins were minted, more silver was diluted, taxes rose to unbearable levels, and every financial fix only made the next crisis even worse. The economy buckled under the weight of constant civil war. Trade routes collapsed as rival armies cut each other off. Cities fortified themselves against Rome's own soldiers. Farmers hid in the hills until armies passed. Merchants fled marketplaces when rumors of another rebellion spread. And while the empire fought itself, its borders weakened. Persia struck in the east. Gothic tribes in the north crossed rivers once guarded by legions now too busy fighting each other. Rome wasn't just collapsing, it was tearing itself apart faster than any enemy could. The 3rd century crisis wasn't a single disaster. It was a storm, a violent, unrelenting storm that swept across the empire, draining its treasury, destroying its stability, and shattering the illusion of Roman invincibility. By the time the civil wars ended, Rome was still standing, but the economy that once supported it was already in pieces. By the end of the 3rd century crisis, Rome was exhausted. Civil wars had drained its treasury. Inflation had shattered its money. Trade routes barely functioned. and the people lived in a world where prices changed by the hour. Then came an emperor determined to stop the chaos, not with gold, but with control. His name was Diocletian. He looked at a broken economy and decided to freeze it in place. If prices were rising, he would set them. If merchants were afraid, he would calm them. If the people were starving, he would force markets to behave. In the year 301, Diocletian issued one of the most ambitious and disastrous economic laws in history, the Edict on Maximum Prices. More than 1,000 goods, services, and wages were listed on giant stone tablets. Bread, grain, wine, cloth, livestock, labor, transport, everything had a legally fixed price. Anyone who charged more could be executed. For a moment, people believed the order would restore stability. But instead, it shattered the economy even faster. Merchants could no longer make a profit, so they hid their goods. Farmers refused to bring grain to market. A black market exploded across the empire. Goods became harder to find than ever before. People feared the law more than they feared inflation. The edict was meant to save Rome. Instead, it crushed what little economic life remained. And so, Diocletian made one final decision. He split the empire in two, east and west, believing it was too large, too expensive, and too unstable to govern as one. The decision would echo for centuries. The east would survive. The west would not. Rome wasn't collapsing yet, but the ground under its feet had begun to crumble. After Diocletian's reforms, the Roman Empire lived on, but it was no longer the world-conquering machine it once was. The East recovered, trade revived, cities grew stronger, its gold reserves deepened, but the West was running out of breath. Tax revenues collapsed as landowners fled heavier and heavier burdens. Whole estates disappeared from records after their owners abandoned them. The population fell after decades of war, plague, and famine, and the state had fewer people each year to tax. Without taxes, the army could not be paid. Without the army, the borders could not be protected. Without protected borders, trade could not survive. And without trade, Rome lost the one thing it depended on more than anything else: movement. Caravans stopped. Ships became rare. Markets shrank. Workshops closed. Every part of the economy slowed, as if the empire were suffocating. Rome began hiring foreign mercenaries, Goths, Franks, Alemanni, paying them with land, titles, and whatever coin the treasury still produced. But mercenaries were not loyal to Rome. They were loyal to payment, and payment was running out. Legions dissolved. Fortresses along borders looked impressive from the outside, but inside, they were half-manned, underfed, and unpaid. In the countryside, farmers tilled land beside abandoned fields. Cities that once glowed with wealth now dimmed slowly, not ruined, but tired. The West was not collapsing in a single moment. It was drifting towards silence, a slow fade of an empire too expensive to keep alive. The world's greatest civilization wasn't defeated. It ran out of the resources it needed to exist. The final years of the Western Roman Empire did not look like the end of a civilization. There were no great fires consuming cities, no armies of enemies flooding the streets, no dramatic last battle beneath the walls of Rome. The empire didn't fall in a single moment. It simply stopped working. Trade routes that once buzzed with caravans became quiet. Ports that once welcomed ships from Africa and Egypt stood nearly empty. The great roads of the empire, the arteries of Rome, saw fewer and fewer travelers. Not because of war, but because there was nothing left to trade. Local officials abandoned their posts. Villages governed themselves. Cities shrank behind their old walls. The imperial administration, once the most advanced system in the world, became thin and fragile. Like parchment left too long in the sun. The government could no longer collect enough taxes to pay its soldiers, and when the soldiers left, the borders dissolved. Tribes that once feared the Roman legions simply walked in, not as conquerors, but as settlers, replacing a government that had already collapsed from within. In 476 AD, when the last Western emperor was quietly removed from his throne, few people even noticed. The empire had already withered away, not in flames, but in silence. Rome fell the way a candle goes out, not with a roar, but with a final, flickering breath. The greatest empire the world had ever seen did not die in battle. It died because its economy, its money, its system of power, everything that held it together, crumbled under its own weight. The fall of Rome was not a defeat. It was a slow surrender to time, debt, and exhaustion.